Hi, welcome to our lecture. In this segment, we're going to be looking at the rebirth of Italian art. We're going to be heading back to Italy and looking at a sort of transition period in art. I like to call it the Proto-Renaissance, but technically it's referred to as Gothic art in Italy. It's really important though because one particular artist that we're going to be looking at, Giotto, really does set the stage, I think, for the Renaissance. So we're heading back to Italy. Italy did not exist as a unified entity the way it does today. The peninsula was divided into to various city-states, some smaller than orders, and they kind of feuded with each other quite a bit. And there was this promotion of civic identity as well. Citizens really identified themselves as Sienese or Florentines and not as Italians the way we think today. Um, I should have gotten in closer. Medieval artists in Italy worked with an elaborate network called a guild system in which artwork was regulated as an industry like any other. Guilds were artist associations that determined, among other things, how long apprenticeships should take, how many apprentices an artist could have, and what the proper route would be for an artist trying to establish him or herself on his or her own. However, female artists were rare because the apprentices lived with their teachers, creating a situation unthinkable for females, although we will encounter some female artists later on. After a successful internship, former apprentices entered the Guild as mature artists and full members. The Guild helped to regulate commissions as well as ensure that not too many people entered the field, a situation that would have driven down prices. So, here the art is very much like an industry and an economy and controlled very much in that way. The guild system remained in effect until replaced by the free market approach that took hold in the 18th century. So we're going to be looking at Italian Gothic painting in the Italian city of Padua, and we're going to be looking at one particular artist, Giotto di Bonde, and he goes by Giotto. And these are some various quotes about what a wonderful painter he was, and he really kind of set the stage for these sort of experimental and innovative ideas like perspective. He brought back sort of the classicizing of figures that really kind of set the stage for the Renaissance to occur. So he was quite ahead of his time. So we're going to be traveling to the Arena or the Scrovegni chapel in Padua, and Giotto did some beautiful frescoes in the interior. Italian citizens had a strong devotional attachment to their local church, sometimes being buried inside. Families commissioned artists to decorate private chapels, occasionally with members of the family serving as models in a religious scene. If the family could not afford a whole chapel, they perhaps could sponsor a sculpture or altarpiece. Um, Rulers, on the other hand, or church leaders in civic-minded institutions, led by laypersons, commissioned works for public display, using them to legitimize their reign or express their public generosity. The modern approach to art as a business run by professionals had its origins in the late Gothic period. Contracts between artists and patrons were drawn up, bookkeeping records of transitions between the two were maintained, and artists self-consciously and confidently began signing works more regularly. Artist signatures indicate their rising status, so that's something that we're going to see. We're going to have a lot more artist names now. And a radical break from the general anonymity in which earlier medieval artists had toiled, and a self-conscious need publicly to associate their names with works of art of which they were particularly proud. And we'll definitely see this with the high Renaissance artists like Michelangelo and Raphael later. So what we're looking at here is a typical painting that you probably would have seen in Italian Gothic painting. This is by Cimbuli. Um, and at first, artists accepted Byzantine formulas for pictorial representations, so it does look very Byzantine. Commonly referred to as the Manneria Greca, or in the Greek manner. Subsequent Florentine painters, however, particularly under the guidance of Giotto, who we're going to be looking at, and his followers, began to move away from this tradition and toward a different concept of reality that substantiated masses and anchored figures to the ground. Through expressive faces and meaningful gestures, emotions became more palpable and dynamic. Florentine painting dares to experiment with compositional arrangements, moving the focus away from the center of the painting. So we're going to see a change. So this was typical, but then towards the end of the Italian Gothic, or the Gothic period, we start to see this transition into what is going to be the early Renaissance. So Giotto is perhaps best known for the frescoes he painted in the Arena, or the Scrovegni chapel. They were commissioned by a wealthy man named Enrico Scrovegni, the son of a well-known banker and a banker himself. According to the church, usury, charging interest for a loan, was a sin. And so perhaps one of Enrico's motivations for building the chapel and having it decorated by Giotto was to atone for the sin of his usury. It has often been suggested that Enrico built the chapel in penitence for his father's sin of usury and to obtain absolution for his own. Enrico's father, Rignaldo degli Scrovegni, is one of the users encountered by Dante in the seventh circle of hell. So he was so bad that he was actually depicted in Dante's very famous novel. So when we look, we see that the exterior of the church is very plain. That's not unusual. That's something we've seen with early Christian churches and Byzantine churches. The chapel became known as the Arena Chapel since it is on the site of an ancient Roman arena or amphitheater that later became the property of the Scrovegni. Whose palace abutted the chapel. The palace was torn down in the 19th century, though parts of the arena remain. And so here's an illustration or drawing of what it would have looked like. Commissioning works of art for churches was a common way of doing good works, which could help you earn your way back into heaven. So this is sort of a motivation that we see in terms of why people would patronize art. The artist who takes the biggest step away from the medieval style of spiritual representation in painting in the early 14th century is Giotto. You can see there are numerous separate images in the chapel. The frescoes tell the story of the lives of Mary, beginning with her parents, her parents and Christ on the long wall. So there are two separate stories, the story of Mary and the story of Christ. By the altar, Giotto painted the Annunciation, and at the other end of the entrance wall, the Last Judgment. So he painted this entire interior. So it's very sumptuous when you come in. That lapis lazuli blue color is gorgeous. Remember, fresco painting is painting on wet plaster. We refer to that as buon fresco or wet plaster. This is what Italians like to paint on. We'll see when we travel to the north in the early Renaissance, oil painting becomes a pretty big phenomenon over there. So when we look, we see that it's a very simple barrel vaulted room. Giotto painted the entire barrel vault using wet fresco. 12 scenes dedicated to the life of the Virgin. The life of Christ is also depicted. We see a star-studded blue sky done in dry fresco, which is secco, or secco. Fresco is secco, S-E-C-C-O. So please get those two terms straight, because I will test you on them. So buon fresco is wet fresco. Secco fresco is dry. The reason why they did the blue with dry um, fresco is that the color would not have been as saturated if it had been wet. So you wouldn't get that really beautiful deep saturated blue color if it was done in wet fresco. Unfortunately, a lot of times the brilliant blue often is the first to sort of peel off and become damaged. So Dante tells the story of Christ and his parents through pictures. Most of the population of Europe was illiterate at the time, and so they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. Bibles were also very rare and expensive in any case, as we saw with illuminated manuscripts, and there was no printing press at the time, and so each copy was done by hand. People learned the stories of the Bible, stories that would help them get to heaven, by hearing the words of the priest in the church and by looking at the paintings and sculptures. Decoration of a chapel not only atoned for Scrivagini's family sins, but also exhibits his power, sophistication, and prestige. Representations of virtue and vices, these are down here at the bottom, line the bottom of the wall, and this is, it looks like marble, but it's actually faux marble. And this is an allegorical grisale, or monochromatic painting. Um, as well, a trompe-l'oeil, which is French for to deceive the eye, is an art technique that uses realistic imagery to create the optical illusion that the depicted object exists in three dimensions. Forced perspective is a comparable illustration, a comparable illusion in architecture to depict inlaid stonework. And so we see that being incorporated in here. So it does look like there's this like stonework, or like faux marble, and then like these are carved, but they're actually painted and disguised to sort of look like they're stone. So it's quite sophisticated and very well done. So here we're looking at a scene. This panel depicts Mary's parents. Remember, there are two stories, the story of Mary and her parents, and then on the other wall, the story of Jesus. And her parents were elderly at the time and beyond childbearing age. You know, his wife had, Joachim's wife had tried to have children, and Joachim takes a sacrifice to the temple to help his wife conceive, and he is expelled out and rejected. So we kind of see this happening right now. This is what Giotto has chosen to portray. Giotto uses architecture to create a stage-like space. And if you look at it, it really kind of looks like a dollhouse, or you know, sort of a stage, or miniature stage, for the figure and the composition to interact. Now that's very important because it grounds the figure. We don't have these floating figures like we had with Byzantine art and early medieval art. So it's grounded, and there's a sense of the illusion of perspective. I mean, obviously it's not correct perspective, but there's a sense of dimension. So we see that step towards you know, more classicizing approaches to art making. The figures in the composition do interact with each other as well. They make eye contact, they gesture with each other. Note the use of directive gazes and expressive gestures. So whatever we look at, or whatever a figure in the painting is looking at or pointing at, we're going to do the same. And so that's a way of controlling the composition and where the viewer's eye goes. And this was done very deliberately by Giotto. Um, the figures themselves look very different. Again, they're not floaty, flat, linear looking figures that we saw earlier with Byzantine and early medieval art, but they have a sense of gravity, they have a sense of weight, and they have a sense of mass. When we look at this painting using infrared light, we can actually see the plaster joints of how Giotto worked. So this is what I'm talking about. It looks like these cracks. And so Giotto would paint a section of a wall at a time. And then, you know, because it dried very quickly, wet plaster, he had to kind of do it in these segments or these joints. And so we can see his work progress through the study of these joints. And it took him about 9 days to paint this particular scene. So looking about at the subject matter of the painting, the priest is physically ejecting Joachim out into an open space. And some historians think that this open negative space or negative scale in the composition might serve as a metaphor for the void and emptiness of not having children. The idea that the couple feels empty because of their plight. So barrenness was also interpreted as a sign that the couple was not in good favor with God. Note the use of modeling and shadowing being utilized with the figures. I'm going to show you a monochromatic example. Is meant to show you this technique. And so we can actually see here how it's darker and it gets lighter. We really do see this use of light and shading to make these figures seem three-dimensional. And so that's something very extraordinary and very classical and not and very unmedieval like. So these figures have volume and weight and they look three-dimensional. Inside the temple, we see a younger man being blessed. That contrast with Joachim, who is being rejected because of his old age. So we see this tension and we see this kind of dichotomy in sort of the placement of the figures. Giotto is a very economic painter in that everything has meaning and logic, and that's something very important to remember about his work. Giotto often depicts narrative through these types of contrasts. In this particular, another panel that we're looking at, Joachim among the shepherds, we see young shepherds exchange unsure glances while the dog is very jovial and playful. Joachim hangs his head down. And so when we look at these figures and their interaction with each other, you really do sense the emotion and clarity of gestures and narratives that is something very deliberate that Giotto does in his work. So we're going to look at a few more panels. This is a nativity scene. Again, note how the figures seem to possess mass and weight. It definitely communicates a narrative through basic human emotion. Giotto wasn't afraid to compositionally slice figures, and it slice figures, and he would use these kind of figures just enough to get the point across. And this sort of whole idea is that you don't need to see the whole. So no, I haven't. This is not sliced. Like I didn't crop this picture. This is how he painted it, and this is very innovative because a medieval painter would never cut off a figure. And it really looks photographic. So it's quite modern in that respect. And you can see how the figures frame and really sort of, this kind of figure acts as a parentheses, these two figures. It's blocking, and he uses their backsides as well, which was unusual. Usually painters didn't paint the backside. You wanted to paint the front. And it kind of blocks the scene in a very specific way. So compositionally, Giotto was a very dynamic painter. He also, we can see the use of foreshortening of heads to emphasize the delivery of the miracle birth taking place. So we can kind of see her head turning. You really do see it. It's still medieval, but it definitely is a transition piece. Here you can see that her robe was done in that beautiful blue color, but because of the dry plaster, it's flaked off. So you can see that that kind of damage throughout these panels. Again, here are the details of the joints and sort of we can see the progress of how he painted this. So we're going to look at some other panels. This particular panel is the resurrection of Lazarus. Notice the little quatrefoil scene to the left right here. This depicts the creation of Adam, which is an Old Testament scene, and we see that sort of prefiguration. So this scene relates to this New Testament scene of the resurrection of Lazarus. So again, we see this use of prefiguration, Old Testament to kind of reference the New Testament that we saw with early Christian art. So we're going to look at this composition. It's interesting compositionally because we don't see all 12 apostles depicted. We see parts of them, but not always the whole figure. So again, the sort of slicing of the figure, um, it really a medieval painter would have just wanted to include everybody and have everyone face forward and, have those details. Again, the use of dynamic composition of slicing the figure is considered a very sort of modern style of painting. We see that Christ is silhouetted against a saturated blue background, gesture of blessing, and the gesture of blessing is emphasized. Christ is often depicted in profile, and this goes back to a tradition of coinage and the way emperors and rulers were nobly depicted on coins and currency. So that's one reason why you see a Christ depicted in profile. We see clear physical lines of gaze between figures that direct the viewer's eye through the composition. Notice how some of the figures in the background cover their noses. And again, this is sort of a realistic sort of idea because, Lazarus is rising from a tomb and he's been dead for 3 days, so he would probably be kind of stinky. And so there's that sort of realistic sort of detail that Giotto has sort of included in the painting that makes it very charming, I think. And, ultimately, Giotto's work has a very cinema graphic style and narrative about it. And, when we start to see, these different methods, of pointing and gazing, we see, the blocking with the figures, we see the slicing of the figures. Again, it has a very modern sensibility to it. This is another panel, The Kiss of Judas. This Christian story is not described in great detail in the Bible. With his description, Giotto elaborates upon the narration. The helmets, these little black helmets in the background, were once silver but have tarnished to black over time. The placement of the spears and the figure's eye contact with one another help to direct the viewer's eyes in a specific orderly way throughout the composition. Half of the sky reserved for weapons that stimulate a violent visual rhythm. He only focuses on a few figures in the background. Judas and Christ embrace that and it contrasts with that chaotic background. So we see that sort of these different contrasts he uses in his paintings. The use of the curve of Judas's gold robe helps to move him forward as creating a frame that emphasizes Christ. Depiction of, and he's decided to depict the moment when Christ is about to be arrested and has been betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. The figure in the pink robe in the foreground almost seems to lean out into our space. I'm going to be talking about this figure. So Giotto creates a dynamic and intimate narrative that would be very relatable to the viewer. And looking at these details, we can see through faces and body language how Giotto has revealed their inner character. The use of physiognomy, this is a Greek term, physis meaning nature, and nogamon meaning the judge or interpreter, is the assessment of a person's character or personality from his or her outer appearance, especially the face. Judas is depicted with a very recessed forehead and a receding hairline, and he kind of looks very beast-like and sort of ape-looking. The use of bestial qualities in the depiction of Judas conveys the notion of his evilness and deceit, and this is something typical that we see in these depictions of Christ and Judas. In contrast, Christ is depicted in a classic profile. He looks handsome, regal, and noble. Christ is looking into Judas's eyes as if to confront him as well as accept his destiny gracefully. Again, note the use of the figure with his back to us, and it's really used to filter and block the scene as well as link central figures together. And again, it's a very sophisticated use of composition to tell a narrative and direct the viewer's eye. All right, so we're going to look at another panel. This is the Lamentation. Here, the Virgin is mourning her son after his crucifixion. Notice the quatrefoil of Jonah and the whale to the left. This Old Testament prefigures the New Testament. Again, innovative use of composition because Giotto places the cross off center. The hillside exhibits a strong diagonal line to direct the viewer's eye and attention to the figure as well, to the figure of Christ. So we see all of these, this line sort of, directing us to the scene that's happening here, and everybody's gaze is looking down, directing our eye to this intimate scene. Better view of it. We see white depiction of skin that contrasts with the other figures, making a point of interest in terms of Christ. Across the wall from this panel is a nativity scene we looked at earlier, showing both the life and death of Christ. So the arrangement of these panels is also very well thought out. Representing Christ as dead and not idealized is something very new. This is a very modern idea. It emphasizes his physical form. So we really see him more as a man instead of some supernatural divine being that we saw with early medieval depictions. The depiction of Mary Magdalene at the feet of Christ, we see her and we see her beautiful red hair. So some other things to note in the composition: the trees without leaves signals it's winter and serves as an analogy of the cycle of life. It will sprout leaves again in the spring. The feet of the figure on the right side help ground the figure. And again, it's not floating like we've seen in medieval art, although it looks a little strange, but definitely grounded. Giotto uses the facial expressions of figures to display different forms of grief. Some are resigned, others fling their arms out, like the figure of Saint John right here. The figures of angels also are in mourning, and they're pretty emotional. They're pretty dramatic up here. So, yeah, they're tearing their clothes, they're pulling their hair out. So what we're looking at are figures that are not detached. These figures show emotion. So that's something very important and new that we're starting to see with art, and will be something important that paves the way for these great Renaissance artists. So there's a sense of exploration of the individuality of emotion. Again, we see the employment of the backs of the two figures that are seated in the foreground, and this is meant to help frame the scene of Christ. The figure in the green robe comes out into our space. And, medieval artists would never have done this. This would have been like, oh, this would have been blasphemy to do this. And so we really do see this level of sophistication and the use of composition that is absent in medieval art. We also see the use of foreshortening with the bowing heads of the figures, in particular here. So that gives us a sense of illusion and dimensionality. As I stated before, the scene recalls the nativity scene when Christ was first born. The cycle comes full circle with the placement of these panels. Again, very well thought out. In this scene, however, Christ is unable to return the gaze to his loving mother that we saw in the nativity scene when he's first born. Notice her raised knee to prop him up right here. That's very realistic detail. And what we're looking at is a natural sort of real life depiction of this Christian narrative. And it's almost heartbreaking, especially when we zoom in and look at these facial expressions. So here's the lamentation scene that I showed you before. So they really do mimic each other. And so the placement of the two across from each other in the church is very well thought out. And it's sad, we see him born and the exchange of looks, and here, he really does look dead. Um, when we look at the panels of Giotto moving from left to right, we also see how Giotto continues the narrative. He reuses the landscape, great attention to detail, and not only in the particular individual panels, but as they as a grouping and as they would be viewed together. So he moves from the lamentation to the resurrection scene where Mary Magdalene recognizes Christ as he says, "Do not touch me." The landscape seems to move downward and really connects the two visual narratives. So again, this composition and the actual layout of all these panels is done in a very sophisticated modern way. The scene of the Last Judgment is placed, so this is right here, so it is the last one viewers would see before leaving the chapel. And we'll kind of look at some images. This should be familiar. Remember we looked at the tympanum relief sculpture when we were looking at the Romanesque period. That was sort of our first introduction to the Last Judgment type scenes. And so it does exhibit that traditional composition for a Last Judgment scene. We see Christ is in the center on a central vertical axis. We also have a detail over here of Scrivigini giving the model of the church to the Virgin Mary. As with most Last Judgment scenes, the heaven side in terms of composition is more stable and static, while the hell side is more dynamic and animated in terms of the composition. And so here you see a close-up of the two. And like I said, as an artist, before, medieval anyway, I think it would be more fun to paint the hell side than the heaven side. The hell side is very reminiscent of Dante's Inferno from the great literary work of the Divine Comedy, which I referenced earlier, which was very popular at the time. We see this figure in the center that's meant to represent Satan as he tortures the damned souls around him. When we look at some other details, we see figures who have participated in the sin of usury being hung with bags of money right up here. Here's that detail of Satan. So as viewers walked back into the real world, the scene of the Last Judgment would have been a reminder of how to live their life. So very different, where with the Romanesque church, it was the first thing that they would have seen coming in. This is the layout of this is a little bit different. Oops. And I guess I'm done. I'm sorry, I'm done. So anyway, stay tuned. We'll be looking at early Renaissance painting in our next segment. So stay tuned.